On the early morning of May 23, 2024 of the year, the first rays of the sun touched the graceful contours of the Villa Bellagio, located in the prestigious district of Milan. This majestic mansion, built at the beginning of the 20th century, was surrounded by 2 hectares of manicured gardens where exquisite fountains gurgled among perfectly trimmed boxwood bushes and luxurious flower beds. Sophie Moretti sat on the spacious second-floor terrace, where she had a breathtaking view of the garden and the panorama of Milan in the distance. She had recently turned 42, but her chiseled features and graceful figure spoke of a woman who looked much younger than her years. Sophie was dressed in an elegant silk Prada dress of soft blue, which perfectly emphasized the color of her eyes. She stared pensively into the distance, slowly stirring her morning espresso with a spoon. The fragrant smell of coffee mingled with the delicate fragrance of magnolias blooming in the garden, creating a unique atmosphere of an Italian morning. But Sophie's thoughts were far from this idyllic picture. For months she had noticed strange behavior of her husband, Marco Moretti. The 52-year-old owner of a large construction company, Moretti Construction, had recently become unusually secretive. He often stayed late at the office, spent long hours behind the closed doors of his home office, and whispered constantly on the phone. Sophie remembered meeting him 15 years ago at a charity event in Paris. Then she was a young French model, just beginning her career, and Marco was a successful Italian businessman who had won her over with his charm and gallantry. Their romance developed rapidly, and in 6 months they played a lavish wedding in an ancient castle in Tuscany. The first years of their marriage were filled with love and mutual understanding. Marco supported Sophie in all her endeavors, whether it was a modeling career or her passion for art. They traveled the world, collected art, and enjoyed life. It seemed like there would be no end to their happiness. But lately, something had changed. Sophie felt Marco drifting away from her. He had become irritable, often avoided talking about company business, and increasingly spent evenings away from home, citing important meetings with his partners. Sophie sighed and shifted her gaze to Giuseppe, the gardener who was trimming the hedges. He was in his 60s, but he was still deft with garden shears, turning ordinary shrubs into works of art. Giuseppe had worked for their family for many years and had witnessed both the happy and the not-so-happy moments of their family life. "Signora, do you like the way I trimmed the boxwood?" Giuseppe asked, noticing the look in Sophie's eyes. "Yes, Giuseppe, you have outdone yourself as always," she replied with a slight smile. This short dialogue brought Sophie back to reality. She remembered their last conversation with Marco over dinner at La Scala, the restaurant next to the famous opera house. It had been 3 days ago, on May 20th. Marco was distracted and had barely touched his favorite saffron risotto. "Darling, are you all right?" Sophie asked then, trying to catch his gaze. "Yes, of course," Marco replied, but his eyes avoided hers. "Just a lot of work lately. You know how important the new downtown project is to us." But Sophie sensed it wasn't just work. Her intuition told her that Marco was hiding something, and that something was much more serious than just work issues. She set the cup with the unfinished coffee on the table and stood up, walking over to the terrace railing. Downstairs at the main gate of the villa, she spotted their driver Paolo washing a black Mercedes S-Class, Marco's favorite car. "Paolo, has Marco left yet?" Sophie shouted. "Yes, signora," replied the driver, raising his head. "Signor Moretti left early this morning in a cab. Said he had an important meeting downtown." This news made Sophie even more wary. Marco never used cabs, preferring the comfort of his car with a private driver. What could be so important and secret that he had decided to drive himself to the meeting? Back in the bedroom, Sophie walked over to Marco's dressing room. She rarely looked in there, respecting her husband's personal space, But now she was overwhelmed with the desire to find some clue to explain his strange behavior. Carefully going through her things, she suddenly came across a small box hidden behind a stack of shirts. Inside was a SIM card and a note with an unfamiliar phone number. Sophie's heart raced. Why would Marco keep a secret SIM card? Back on the terrace, Sophie sat down at the table again, trying to gather her thoughts. She was faced with questions she couldn't find answers to. Why was Marco going on business trips so often? Where did the large sums in their joint account come from that he refused to talk about? And most importantly, why did he no longer look her in the eye when they talked about the future? Sophie could feel the anxiety building up inside her. She had loved and trusted Marco all these years. But now, for the first time in their marriage, she was beginning to doubt. What if there was something dark and dangerous lurking behind their family's outward well-being? Looking at the panorama of Milan spread out before her, Sophie realized she could no longer live in ignorance. She must find out the truth, no matter how bitter it might be, and she would need help to uncover a secret that would possibly change the rest of her life. Sophie didn't yet know exactly how she would proceed, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't stop until she found out what Marco Moretti was hiding. In the following days, Sophie watched Marco closely, noting every detail of his behavior. On May 25th, during a family dinner at their favorite restaurant, Il Salumaio di Monte Napoleone on Via Monte Napoleone, she noticed Marco nervously rubbing his napkin, constantly glancing at his phone. "Darling, are you expecting an important call?" Sophie asked, trying to hide the worry in her voice. Marco flinched as if he'd been caught off guard. "No, it's nothing special. Just checking for messages from the contractors on the new project." But Sophie noticed the way his fingers trembled as he tucked his phone back into his pocket. It was quite unlike the confident businessman she'd known all these years. The next day, May 26th, Sophie decided to check on the family finances. She opened their joint online banking account and started looking at the latest transactions. What she saw made her heart beat faster. Over the past 3 months, several large sums of money had been deposited into the account from unknown sources. The total amount exceeded 2 million euros. Sophie tried to remember if Marco had mentioned any large transactions or unexpected income, but nothing of the sort came to mind. Moreover, when she tried to talk about the company's finances, Marco always avoided answering, saying he didn't want to bore her with business matters. That evening, Sophie decided to talk to Marco directly. She waited for him in the living room, nervously fumbling with a glass of red Barolo wine. Marco returned late, around 11 p.m., looking tired and tense. "Marco, we need to talk," Sophie began as soon as he entered the room. "About what, dear? I'm very tired. Maybe tomorrow." Marco tried to smile, but the smile came out strained. "No, it's important. I saw our bank account. Where is this money coming from, Marco? 2 million euros in 3 months is not the usual income from your company." Marco froze in place, his face pale. "Sophie, it's hard to explain. Just trust me, it's fine. It's the result of a few good deals." "What deals? Why didn't you tell me about them?" Sophie could feel the anxiety building up inside. "Look, in business, sometimes there are situations that are better left unsaid. I didn't want to bother you until things settled down." Marco spoke quickly, avoiding a direct look. "Not to bother you. Marco, we've been married 15 years. When did you start hiding things from me?" Sophie's voice held resentment and frustration. Marco walked over to her and tried to hug her, but Sophie pulled away. "I'm sorry. I really should have told you. I promise I'll explain everything soon. Just give me some time." With those words, he quickly left the room, leaving Sophie even more perplexed and anxious. The next few days passed in a tense atmosphere. Marco tried to behave as usual, but Sophie noticed how he avoided long conversations and tried to spend more time out of the house. On May 29th, an event occurred that finally convinced Sophie that something was seriously wrong. She happened to overhear Marco's phone conversation as she walked past his office. "Yes, everything is going according to plan. The goods will be delivered on time. No, no one is guessing anything. Yes, I understand the risks, but the profits are worth it." Sophie froze outside the door, her heart pounding frantically. What product was Marco talking about? What risks did he mean? These words sounded nothing like the usual business talk of a construction magnate. That night, lying awake in their huge bedroom, Sophie tried to piece together all the oddities in her husband's behavior over the past months. Frequent trips to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, ostensibly to meet with investors. New acquaintances he'd never told her about in detail. Strange phone conversations and messages that he immediately deleted. On May 30th, Sophie decided to act. She called her longtime friend Laura, who worked for the Milan police. "Laura, I need your help," Sophie said, meeting her friend at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. "What's wrong, Sophie? You look worried." Laura looked at her friend with concern. Sophie told her about her suspicions, Marco's strange behavior and the overheard phone conversation. Laura listened attentively and then said thoughtfully, "Sophie, I don't want to scare you, but this sounds serious. Marco may be involved in something illegal, but we need proof before we can do anything about it." "What am I supposed to do, Laura? I can't just sit and wait." Tears glistened in Sophie's eyes. Laura thought for a moment, then pulled a business card out of her purse. "Here, take it. These are the contacts for Fabio Conti, a private detective. He's the best in the business and knows how to be discreet. If anyone can figure out what's going on, it's him." On the 1st of June, Sophie ventured to call Fabio Conti. The detective's voice in the telephone receiver sounded calm and professional. "Signora Moretti, I understand your situation. Let's meet tomorrow in my office and you will give me all the details." The next day, June 2nd, Sophie nervously adjusted her hair as she stood in front of a door with a sign that read, "Fabio Conti, Private Investigations." She took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," came a male voice. Fabio Conti turned out to be a man of about 45, with a shrewd eye and calm manners. He listened carefully to Sophie's story, asking clarifying questions and making notes in a small notebook. "Signora Moretti, I am taking up your case," he said when Sophie had finished her story. "We will proceed cautiously and discreetly. I will keep you informed of any facts discovered." Walking out of the detective's office, Sophie felt strangely relieved. Now she was not alone in her suspicions and fears. Someone competent was investigating. But along with the relief came guilt. She'd hired a detective to follow the man she'd loved for 15 years, the man with whom she'd shared her life, her dreams, her most intimate moments. Returning home in a cab, Sophie looked at the streets of Milan, at the elegant passers-by going about their business, at the windows of fashionable boutiques. This city had always been for her a symbol of beauty and luxurious life. Now she felt like a stranger, as if she were in the center of some intricate thriller. As they approached the Villa Bellagio, Sophie saw Marco's car in the driveway. He rarely came home so early. For a moment she wanted to turn around and drive away, avoid seeing him. But she forced herself to get out of the cab and into the house. Marco met her in the hall with a bouquet of her favorite white peonies. "Sophie, darling, I'm so glad you're back. I was thinking maybe we should have a romantic dinner tonight. Just you and me, just like old times." Sophie looked at her husband, at his smiling face, at the flowers in his hands, and felt love and suspicion, hope and fear struggling inside her. She forced herself to smile and replied, "Of course, darling, it will be wonderful." Taking the bouquet, she went up to her room to change for dinner. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, Sophie thought about the fact that this evening could be crucial. Either she would find the strength to trust Marco and believe that all her fears were a figment of her imagination, or she didn't want to think about the second possibility. As she walked down to the dining room, Sophie could feel her heart pounding. She knew there was something more behind this romantic dinner, and she was ready to face the truth, whatever it was. On June 3rd, at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, Fabio Conti parked his unremarkable gray Fiat Tipo on Via Montenapoleone, 2 blocks from the Moretti construction office. The detective sat in the car, watching the entrance to the building through the rearview mirror. On the passenger seat was a folder with information about Marco Moretti that Fabio had managed to gather over the past 24 hours. At 10 minutes past 10, a black Mercedes S-Class stopped at the entrance to the office building. Marco Moretti stepped out of it, dressed in an impeccably fitting dark blue Brioni suit. Fabio took a few shots with his hidden camera, noting that the businessman looked tense and was constantly looking around. As soon as Marco disappeared into the building, Fabio pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Hello, Signora Moretti? This is Fabio Conti. I've started surveillance on your husband. Nothing out of the ordinary yet, but I'll keep you informed." "Thank you, Signor Conti." Sophie's voice sounded nervous. I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing, but I need to know the truth. I understand your feelings, Signora. Believe me, such situations are not uncommon in my practice. Let's wait for the facts before we draw conclusions." Finished with the conversation, Fabio went back to observing. For the next 4 hours, nothing remarkable happened. Marco did not leave the office, and the company employees went in and out as usual. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the situation changed. Marco Moretti promptly left the building and got into a waiting cab rather than his Mercedes. Fabio quickly started the car and followed them, keeping their distance. The cab with Marco headed towards the Porta Nuova district, known for its modern skyscrapers and business centers. 20 minutes later, it stopped at the entrance to the tower, one of Milan's tallest buildings. Fabio parked nearby and watched as Marco entered the building. The detective checked his records. Moretti Construction had no offices in this building, and as far as he knew, the company had no partners located here. It was almost 2 hours before Marco left the building. He looked agitated and kept checking his cell phone. Instead of hailing a cab, he took a quick step toward the nearest subway station. Fabio followed him at a safe distance. On the subway, the detective took a position in the next carriage, keeping his eyes on Marco. They traveled several stops before Marco got off at the Porta Venezia station. Exiting the subway, Marco headed toward Indro Montanelli Park. He walked quickly, constantly looking around. In the park, Marco sat on a bench by a small fountain and waited for someone. Fabio took a position behind a thick bush from where the bench was clearly visible. 10 minutes later, a tall man in dark glasses and a cap approached Marco. They spoke briefly, after which the stranger handed Marco a small envelope. The exchange happened so quickly that if Fabio hadn't been watching closely, he might have missed the moment. The detective took several pictures of the encounter, trying to capture the stranger's face. After that, Marco and the unknown man went off in different directions. Fabio continued to follow Marco, who returned to the subway and drove back to the city center. After getting off at the Duomo station, Marco entered the bar La Rinascente on the top floor of the department store of the same name, where he had an impressive view of the Milan Cathedral. Taking a table nearby, Fabio watched as Marco ordered an espresso and pulled from his pocket the envelope he had received in the park. After finishing his coffee, Marco left the bar and headed back to his office. Fabio decided that the surveillance was enough for today and went to his office to analyze the information he had gathered. In the evening of the same day, Fabio called Sophie. "Signora Moretti, I have some news. Your husband met today with an unknown man in Montanelli Park. They exchanged an envelope. I also noticed that Signor Moretti visited the Unicorn Tower. although as far as I know his company has no office there." Sophie listened to the detective, feeling her heart clench with anxiety. "What can this mean, Signor Conti?" "It is too early to draw conclusions, Signora. It could be part of normal business activity, or it could be something more serious. I need to keep watching and gather more information." The next day, June 4th, Fabio decided to focus on the Unicorn Tower. He spent several hours watching the entrance to the building and taking pictures of people entering and exiting. Around noon, his attention was caught by a man very similar to the man Marco had met in the park. He entered the building and an hour later came out accompanied by two heavily built men who looked like bodyguards. Fabio took some clear pictures and sent them to his police contact for identification. The reply came a few hours later and made the detective frown. The man in the photo was identified as Antonio Ferrara, a businessman of dubious reputation known to the police and suspected of having links to organized crime. In the evening, Fabio called Sophie again. "Signora Moretti, I have new information. The man your husband met with is allegedly connected to the underworld. I don't want to scare you, but the situation may be more serious than we thought." Sophie felt her breath catch. "My God. What am I going to do, Signor Conti?" "Nothing yet, Signora. Go on with your usual behavior. Don't let your husband know that you suspect anything. I will continue to investigate and try to find out how deeply your husband is involved in this situation." The next day, June 5th, Fabio decided to widen the scope of his investigation. He began by checking Moretti Construction's financial records, which were publicly available. At first glance, everything looked fine. The company was showing steady growth and good profits. However, digging deeper, Fabio discovered several suspicious transactions with offshore companies. The amounts were significant and did not correspond to the usual activities of the construction company. The detective also turned his attention to Moretti Construction's recent project, the construction of a large shopping center on the outskirts of Milan. The project received all the necessary permits with surprising speed, which was atypical for Italian bureaucracy. Fabio decided to check the connections between Moretti Construction and the city administration. He called his old friend Giorgio, who worked in Milan City Hall. "Giorgio, buddy, I need your help. What can you tell me about the Moretti Construction Shopping Center project?" Giorgio was silent for a few seconds before answering. "Fabio, I wouldn't dig too deep if I were you. There's a lot of weirdness surrounding this project. Some officials have suddenly acquired expensive watches and new cars." This information only strengthened Fabio's suspicions. He thanked his friend and continued his investigation. On June 6th, Fabio decided to follow Antonio Ferrara. He took up a position near the Unicorn Tower early in the morning and waited. Around 10 o'clock, Ferrara emerged from the building accompanied by two bodyguards. They got into a black SUV with tinted windows and headed toward an industrial district on the outskirts of Milan. Fabio followed them at a safe distance. Half an hour later, the SUV stopped outside a warehouse complex. Ferrara and his men went inside. The detective parked nearby and watched. An hour later, a truck pulled up to the warehouse. Several large crates were unloaded from it and taken inside. Fabio took a few pictures and wrote down the truck's license plate number. Something told him that these crates could be a clue to the whole story. That evening, Fabio met with Sophie again in his office. She looked exhausted and nervous. "Signora Moretti, I understand how difficult this is for you, but I need to ask you a few questions. Have you noticed any changes in your family's financial situation recently? Perhaps unexpected large purchases or new investments?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Yes, now that you ask. Marco recently talked about buying a villa on Lake Como. He said it was a great investment, but I was surprised by the amount, almost 5 million euros. I didn't understand where we were getting that kind of money from." Fabio nodded, making notes. "What about his behavior at home? Are there any changes in his daily routine? New habits? He started working more often at night in his home office. Sometimes I hear him talking to someone on the phone in a whisper. And also, Sophie hesitated. Go on, Signora. Any detail could be important. I recently found a second cell phone in his things, a very simple one, not a smartphone. When I asked him about it, Marco got angry and said it was for work and to mind my own business. Fabio listened intently, analyzing every word. Signora Moretti, I will not hide from you. The situation looks serious. All indications are that your husband may be involved in illegal activities, but we need more solid evidence. Sophie turned pale. What do you suggest? I need access to your husband's files. There's bound to be something in his home office that might shed some light on this situation. Could you help me with that? Sophie hesitated. The thought of spying on her own husband in their home seemed horrible to her, but she realized there was no other option. All right, she finally said. Marco is leaving for a business meeting in Rome the day after tomorrow. I'll be able to let you into the house. On June 8th, at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, Sophie paced nervously around the spacious living room of Villa Bellagio. Marco had left for Rome early that morning, and the house seemed unusually quiet and empty. Every sound, the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, the rustling of leaves outside the window made her shudder. At 9:30, the doorbell rang. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and went to open it. On the threshold stood Fabio Conti, dressed in a simple gray suit with a small briefcase in his hand. Good morning, Signora Moretti, the detective said quietly as he entered the house. Are you sure the servants won't show up unexpectedly? Sophie nodded. Yes, I gave everyone the day off. We're the only ones in the house. Fabio looked around. Good. Show me your husband's office. They went up to the second floor. In front of the study door, Sophie stopped, her hand trembling as she pulled out the key. Signora, if it is difficult for you, you may not be present for the examination, Fabio said softly. Sophie shook her head. No, I must know the truth, whatever it is. They entered the office. It was a spacious room with a large oak desk, wood-paneled walls, and an impressive bookcase. On the walls hung paintings by famous Italian artists and pictures of Marco with various businessmen and politicians. Fabio immediately got to work. He began by looking through the desk drawers, methodically going through each document. Most of the papers seemed to be ordinary business contracts and reports. After an hour of painstaking work, the detective suddenly froze, staring at one of the documents. What did you find? Sophie asked, noticing his reaction. Fabio showed her the paper. It's a contract for the purchase of a plot of land on the outskirts of Milan. The amount of the deal is 20 million euros. But here's the strange thing. The price is clearly inflated. The real value of this plot of land can't be more than 5 or 6 million. Sophie frowned. What could that mean? It's a classic money laundering scheme, Fabio explained. Buying overvalued real estate is one way to legalize large sums of illegal income. Continuing his search, Fabio found several other similar contracts. They were all related to a recent shopping center project that Moretti Construction had begun building on the outskirts of the city. Signora Moretti, I'm afraid the situation is more serious than we thought, Fabio said as he gathered the documents. It seems your husband is involved in a major money laundering scheme, and judging by the scale of it, he's not the only one behind it. Sophie felt herself getting dizzy. She slumped down in her chair, trying to comprehend what she had heard. But how is that possible? Marco has always been an honest businessman. He built this company from the ground up. Fabio looked at her sympathetically. People change, Signora. Sometimes the lure of easy money is too great. Suddenly the sound of the front door opening caught their attention. Sophie looked at Fabio in a panic. It's Marco! He wasn't supposed to be back this early. Fabio quickly gathered all the documents and stashed them in his briefcase. "Quickly, Signora. Distract him and I'll try to get out the back door unnoticed." Sophie nodded and hurried downstairs. She met Marco in the hall, trying to look as natural as possible. "Darling, you're so early. I thought you wouldn't be back until tonight." Marco looked tense and anxious. "The meeting in Rome was canceled at the last minute. Did something happen? You look worried." Sophie tried to smile. "No, it's not. I just wasn't expecting you so early. I was just on my way to lunch. Will you join me?" Marco shook his head. "No, I still have things to do. I'll be in the study." Sophie's heart sank. She knew Fabio was still there. "Why don't we have coffee on the terrace first? It's such a lovely day." But Marco was already heading for the stairs. "I'm sorry, darling, but it's urgent. I need to check something." Sophie watched in despair as her husband went upstairs. She heard the study door open and held her breath, expecting a scream or the sound of a struggle. But nothing happened. A few minutes later, Marco came back downstairs. He looked worried, but not angry or suspicious. "Sophie, have you seen the folder with the blue cover on my desk? I distinctly remember leaving it there." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. "No, darling. I didn't go into your office. Maybe you put it somewhere else?" Marco frowned. "That's odd. Okay, I'll look again." He went upstairs again. As soon as he was out of sight, Sophie heard a quiet knock on the back door. She quickly opened it and saw Fabio. "I barely made it out in time," the detective whispered. "We were lucky he didn't see me. Signora Moretti, the situation is critical. We need to meet tomorrow and discuss the way forward." Sophie nodded, and Fabio quickly disappeared into the garden. Closing the door, she leaned against it, feeling her knees shake. The world she had known was crumbling before her eyes. That evening, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the breathing of Marco sleeping next to her. The man she had lived with for 15 years had suddenly become alien and dangerous to her. She remembered their first meeting, their wedding, their happy years together, and couldn't believe it could all have been a lie. The next morning, June 9th, Sophie met Fabio in a small cafe on the outskirts of Milan. The detective looked serious and preoccupied. "Signora Moretti, I've analyzed the documents we found," he began as soon as they sat down at the table. "The situation is much more serious than we thought. Your husband is not just involved in money laundering. He appears to be connected to a major criminal organization." Sophie felt her breath catch. "Oh my God, what do we do now?" Fabio looked at her thoughtfully. "We have two options. The first is we can go to the police with the evidence we have. That would lead to your husband's arrest and probably a high-profile lawsuit." Sophie turned pale. "And the second option? We can continue the investigation on our own, gather more evidence, and try to figure out how deeply your husband is involved in this scheme. Perhaps we can find a way to get him out of this situation with less damage." Sophie thought for a moment. The thought that Marco might be arrested terrified her. Despite everything she had learned, she still loved him. "Let's keep investigating," she finally said. "I want to know the whole truth before I make a final decision." Fabio nodded. "All right. But you must realize that this could be dangerous. The people your husband has contacted will stop at nothing to protect their interests." "I understand," Sophie replied quietly. "But I have to do it. For myself, for Marco, for everything I've believed in all these years." Over the next few days, Fabio continued his investigation. He followed Marco, studied the company's financial records, met with informants in Milan's police and business circles. The picture that was emerging was grim. Moretti Construction was at the center of a complex scheme involving bribery of officials, sham contracts, and money laundering from illegal activities. On June 15th, Fabio met with Sophie again. This time they chose a secluded spot in Sempione Park. "Signora Moretti, I have some news." the detective said as they settled on a bench away from the strolling public. "I have discovered that your husband has been meeting regularly with a man named Luca Berti. Does that name mean anything to you?" Sophie frowned. "No, I've never heard of him." "Luca Berti is a well-known man in certain circles. He's connected to the Calabrian mafia 'Ndrangheta. According to my sources, he is the one who implicated your husband in this scheme." Sophie felt herself getting dizzy. The mafia? My God, how could Marco get involved with such people? Fabio sighed. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than you think. It usually starts with a small favor that seems harmless. Then another, and another, and another. And then the person is already up to their neck in criminal activity with no way to get out." "What do we do now?" Sophie asked, feeling tears coming to her throat. "I have a plan," replied Fabio, "but it's a risky one. We can try to gather enough evidence to expose the whole scheme, including high-ranking officials and mobsters. If we can do that, your husband has a chance at a deal with the investigation. He could avoid jail if he agrees to cooperate with the authorities." Sophie thought for a moment. The thought of putting Marco in front of such a choice frightened her, but she realized there might be no other choice. "What do I have to do?" she asked finally. "Continue with your usual behavior," Fabio replied, "but be attentive to every detail. Every conversation, every document you see could be important. And most importantly, be careful. If Marco or his partner suspect anything, the consequences could be very serious." Sophie nodded, feeling the adrenaline pulsing through her veins. She knew she was embarking on a dangerous path, but it was too late to back down. On June 20th, at exactly midnight, Sophie paced nervously around the bedroom of the Villa Bellagio. Marco hadn't come home yet, which had become a regular occurrence lately. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Fabio Conti. "The meeting is tomorrow at noon. Warehouse on Via Industriale. Be careful." Sophie's heart raced. Over the past few days, Fabio had managed to find out that Marco and his partners were planning a major deal. This was their chance to get hard evidence. The next day, June 21st, Sophie left the house on the pretext of shopping with her friends. Instead, she met Fabio not far from the said warehouse. "Signora Moretti, are you sure you want to do this?" the detective asked, looking at her with concern. Sophie nodded, though her hands were trembling. "Yes, I have to see everything with my own eyes." They took up position in an abandoned building opposite the warehouse, which offered a good view. Fabio set up a camera with a powerful zoom. At exactly noon, 3 black SUVs pulled up to the warehouse. Marco stepped out of the first car, followed by Antonio Ferrara and several other men Sophie didn't know. "That's Luca Berti," Fabio whispered, pointing to a tall man in an expensive suit. "The head of the local 'Ndrangheta cell." Sophie felt her breath catch. Seeing Marco in the company of these men was painful and frightening. Soon a truck pulled up. Several large crates were unloaded from it. Marco and Berti talked briefly about something, and then one of the crates was opened. Fabio whistled. Weapons, very expensive and undoubtedly illegal. Sophie covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming. Her husband, the man she'd loved for 15 years, was involved in the arms trade. Suddenly, there was the wail of police sirens. Several police cars were approaching the warehouse at high speed. "Shit!" Fabio scolded. "Someone tipped them off. We have to leave, fast." They hurriedly left their hiding place, but Sophie couldn't take her eyes off what was happening outside the warehouse. She could see Marco and the others trying to escape as the police surrounded the building. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. Sophie was horrified to see Marco fall to the ground. "Marco!" she screamed, trying to run to him, but Fabio grabbed her arm tightly. "No, signora. There is nothing you can do to help him now. We must leave or we too will be in danger." Barely containing her sobs, Sophie let Fabio lead her away. The next few hours passed like a blur. Fabio took Sophie to safety, a small apartment on the outskirts of Milan. There they watched the news, which reported a major police operation to arrest a group of arms dealers. Among those detained is the well-known Milanese businessman Marco Moretti, the news anchor was saying. According to preliminary reports, Moretti was lightly wounded while trying to escape and is now under guard at the hospital. Sophie felt both relief and horror at the same time. Marco was alive, but his life, like her own, would never be the same again. 2 days later, on June 23rd, Sophie was finally able to see Marco. He was lying in a hospital room, pale and gaunt, with a bandage on his shoulder. "Sophie," he whispered when he saw her. His eyes read pain, shame, and remorse. Sophie sat down beside his bed, not knowing what to say. There were so many questions running through her head, so many accusations rolling off her tongue. But instead, she simply asked, "Why, Marco?" Marco closed his eyes as if in pain. "I didn't mean for things to turn out this way. At first it was just a small favor, to help get a building permit, to turn a blind eye to some violations. I thought it would help the business. But then I was trapped. They threatened you, threatened our family. I didn't know how to get out." Sophie listened to his confession, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. She realized their lives were ruined, but a part of her still loved this man, despite all his mistakes. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Marco sighed. "My lawyer says that if I cooperate with the investigation, I have a chance at a reduced sentence. But the company, everything we've built over the years, it's over." Sophie took his hand. "We'll get through this, Marco. Somehow we'll get through this." Sophie held herself courageously in public, but in private she often cried, remembering the happy years of their marriage and wondering if anything could have been changed. On July 15th, the preliminary hearing was held. Marco, following the advice of his lawyer, fully admitted his guilt and agreed to cooperate with the investigation. His testimony helped to uncover the entire scheme, including the involvement of high-ranking officials and businessmen. The court sentenced Marco to 5 years in prison with the possibility of early release for good behavior. It was far less than he could get, but for Sophie, those 5 years seemed like an eternity.